Madam President,
Senator from Missouri.
move we suspend the quorum call.
Without objection.
And I'd like to speak for a few minutes. I want to start by talking about these court cases yesterday that create more complications, particularly for the president's health care plan. The idea that the law is specific, which is what the Washington, D.C. Federal Court of Appeals said, that the law specifically says in a case that they had dealt with that you can only get the taxpayer subsidy if you work through the state exchanges. There's no question that the law in dealing with this issue in clear comments makes that case, and the judges agreed that that was the case that was made. Now, what happened was, not only did many states not decide to set up the exchanges because of the expense involved and the problems involved and the complication of the law, but even states that did set up the exchanges couldn't get them to work. I don't know that any state spent more money than Oregon did. Certainly they spent a lot of money, and in the first 6 months didn't sign up anybody. Nobody, not a single person was able to sign up through the exchange that they had set up. Massachusetts, who'd actually had experience with its own law, and I would have thought would have been the easiest possible exchange to set up, also admitted that they failed and that they would, if you lived in Massachusetts, you need to go through the federal exchange. I think 36 states have either not set up the exchange or tried to and failed. And so in 36 states, people, the only option they have to get insurance in an exchange as an individual, and many of their other policies were previously canceled because of the law, is to go to the federal exchange. And now the court, in a ruling in the D.C. court, says, well, you can go to the federal exchange. Now, we should understand this, and I've been on record saying if you have to have it, I think you should try your best to have insurance. If the insurance you need is what the federal government prescribes that you should have, and that's insurance you should afford, obviously the exchange can be a place to get it, and it's a place to get insurance whether it's subsidized or not. But many people will find that those new higher rates at the exchange without taxpayer assistance just don't work for them. The law was poorly written, it was poorly structured, it was crammed down the throats of the minority in both the House and the Senate, and, in my view, healthcare providers and people who want insurance in the country in the way it was passed. There are many lessons to be learned from the Affordable Care Act, and one is never pass a piece of legislation this way. Because a Richmond court yesterday said, well, no, there are other places in the law, even though they surely said it was clear where the law refers to subsidizing people who get insurance through the exchange. They surely knew that was clear, but they said, no, there are other places in the law that indicate maybe that's not the way it was. So now why is that? Why wasn't that debated on the floor of the Senate and on the floor of the House? It wasn't debated because one side decided they were going to do this exactly the way they wanted to do it, and they were going to do it by themselves. There was that brief moment where there were 60 Democrats in the Senate. They passed the current law that I fully believe nobody expected would be the health care law. You know, the way we used to pass laws in the Congress through the entire constitutional history of the country was that the Senate would pass a bill, the House would pass a bill, and then you'd go to conference and figure out, one, how the two bills came together, but also what didn't make as much sense when you had time to step back and look at it as it seemed to make in the heat of the floor debate. Well, that didn't happen with this law. Why didn't it happen with this law? Because by the time the Senate passed the bill and it was time for the House to deal with it, there were suddenly 59 senators of the Democratic side of the majority in the Senate. Remember the Scott Brown election from Massachusetts? Everybody was surprised except maybe Scott Brown, but he was elected and there were no longer 60 votes in the Senate, which is what it takes to do whatever you want to do. So apparently the message to the House of Representatives, controlled by the Democrats and Speaker Pelosi, was the only way we are going to pass a health care bill that goes anywhere near this floor is to pass the bill that the Senate passed. There will be no conference. There will be no cleaning up this piece of legislation. There will be no discussion as to what we could do to actually make this work. We're going to pass this bill. And not a single Republican in the Senate voted for it, and not a single Republican in the House would vote for it. And what's the unintended consequence of that? How do you then go back and clean the bill up? You've decided, if you participate in that process, that your momentary power is so important that you're not going to involve anybody else's ideas in a way that got a single vote of the other side. One of the great lessons to learn here is if you're going to mess with everybody's health care and you're going to impact 16 or 18% of the entire economy, you'd better have buy-in from more than just one group of Americans that represent one political party or one point of view. And so now we have this confusion that will go on until I assume the Supreme Court determines the difference in these two federal courts of appeals. But it'll be months before that happens. It'll be months before that happens, and we'll see if taxpayers subsidize others getting their insurance or not. We'll see what happens to people who got a subsidy if the subsidy turns out to be one that was inappropriately given, and we'll see how we move forward on that. And then there's also this discussion going on, some of which we had on the floor here last week, of religious freedom as it relates to that law. There's a so-called accommodation for religious groups that don't believe in that they should have to pay for certain things. The Little Sisters of the Poor, who, by the way, were listed on one advocacy group for the law as it's being applied. The Little Sisters of the Poor were listed as one of the 100 dirty employers in America because they were one of the 100 church groups and others that tried to take this idea to court that you could be forced to do things that violate your faith principles. Now, if we've come to a point that the Little Sisters of the Poor are one of the evil employers in America, we better think about how we got to this point. And actually, Justice Sotomayor gave on her own, the Little Sisters of the Poor said, not only do we not want to do this, we don't agree with the so-called accommodation that if we'll sign a piece of paper that says we don't want to do this, but our insurance company will. Now, what did the Little Sisters of the Poor think was wrong with that? What could possibly be wrong with that? All you're asked to do is sign a piece of paper that says you believe something is wrong, but it's okay with you if somebody else pays for it. Well, that's obviously not right. And Justice Sotomayor, on her own, gave the relief that the Little Sisters of the Poor asked for, but then only a few weeks later, she's outraged when the rest of the court gives the exact same relief to Wheaton College. Wheaton College, a Christian college near Chicago, the president's home state, a long-term commitment to their faith principles. They basically say, well, just like the Little Sisters of the Poor, we don't believe this is right, and we don't want to sign a piece of paper that says we think it's wrong, but it's okay with us if somebody else pays for it. And then a story I just read today was the constant concern that the health care plan narrows your ability to get health care because it restricts the networks that you can go to. In at least one state, half of the hospitals in the state don't participate in anything you can get access to through the Affordable Care Act as an individual or a family. So you have to drive by your old hospital, drive by your old doctor's office to get to a doctor or hospital that may or may not see you. I think the hospital has to see you. I don't think the doctor does. But you have to drive by to get there. We've just had this big discussion. I had the great opportunity to speak at the National Convention of the Veterans of Foreign Wars on Monday, and obviously, like everybody else there, I had on my mind what was happening with the Veterans Administration. At the same time, we're talking about how to give veterans more choices. We're talking about how to give everybody else fewer choices. Networks, that was a great quote. I said, networks help contain cost. Well, of course they do. If you can't get to see the doctor or it's inconvenient to go to the hospital, of course it contains cost. And then the bill on the floor this week about economic opportunity, economic advancement, one of the great attacks on that has been the attack on the 40-hour work week. And what happened to the 40-hour work week for many, many people working in the country? The federal government, for the first time ever, said, well, you have to provide insurance, and this is what it has to look like. Whether you can afford it as an employer or not, whether your employees want to take it or not, you have to provide insurance. This is what it's supposed to look like for everybody that works 30 hours or more. And so all of a sudden, government actions have consequences, no matter what the administration might think about EPA rules on water, EPA rules on the utility bill, HHS rules on health care. Actions have consequences, and lots of people that used to work 40 hours now may be working 50 hours, but they're doing it at two different jobs, neither of which have benefits. The 40-hour job that in more cases than not had benefits that both the employer and the employee thought were good. 85% of everybody that got insurance at work, health insurance at work, thought it was good, thought it met their needs, 85%. And most people had insurance at work. But now many people go to work without insurance because the only people at the place they go to work that get insurance are the managers, are the longtime employees, are the people who work more than 30 hours. The chances to advance if you're in a part-time job are a lot less than the chances to advance if you're in a full-time job. I just suggest, Madam President, if we were really trying to get people to work here this week instead of make political points, we'd be talking about the 40-hour work week. We'd be talking about the manufacturers, advanced manufacturing bill that the senator from Ohio, Mr. Brown, and I have, that others are very interested in, and it's bipartisan interest. We'd be talking about the Bridge Act that allows more infrastructure building that Senator Warner and I have, another bipartisan piece of legislation. We'd be talking about the Build America Act that helps state and local government with infrastructure by allowing companies, the very companies apparently they're being talked about this week in a piece of legislation everybody knows can't pass and has no bipartisan support, talking about companies that would be allowed to bring profits from that they've made overseas. They've paid taxes on overseas, but they'd be allowed to bring those profits here in a way that would encourage state and local governments to expand their infrastructure, maintain their infrastructure, make their sewer system, their water system, their road and bridge system all work better. The unintended consequences of not thinking through what is the constitutional responsibility of the House and Senate are significant. We need to understand the impact of what we do and the impact of what we fail to do. Failing to have a healthcare system that meets people's needs, failing to have a 40-hour work week that we figure out how to encourage rather than discourage, failing to get people into that first job is a failure that lasts for a long time. If you don't advance in your 20s at work like you should, when you get to be 30, somebody else in a better economy in their 20s is likely to pass you because the opportunity you had was disrupted by circumstances the government couldn't control, or in many cases today, circumstances the government could control and works to make and actually works in a way that make those circumstances worse, not better. And so, Madam President, I'd like to see us do the kinds of things that get people to work, talk about the kinds of legislation that's bipartisan, that could pass both houses of the Congress. There's plenty of it out there. I continue to hope that we figure out how to get to it, and I would yield the floor.